Welcome to Great War Story, the life and times of Robert Bruce Fowler, who was a soldier in World War One in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force from 1914 to 1919. And also, he was my grandfather. Now, I've been obsessing about this topic for quite a few years now, and I want to tell you the story about how I first got into studying the World War One story of my grandfather, because it doesn't come from any letters or diaries. He was one of these World War One soldiers who never really talked about the war. And the whole story starts with this magazine, the New Zealand Listener, this particular issue in 2008. And when you first see it, nothing stands out that would have anything to do with my family history. There's a pretty classic, clickbait equivalent for a magazine, having Hitler on the cover and all of the rest. But my mother suddenly got a phone call out of nowhere from an old friend of hers back from, well, when she was young, saying, "Have you seen the latest issue of The Listener?" And my mother said, "No, I don't even buy The Listener." And her friend said, "I think your father's in it." So, of course, she hurried out and bought it. And there was this story inside the magazine: The Soldier's Kodak. Photographs shape our visual memories of World War One, illuminating its great themes. A new book and exhibition reveals New Zealand's rich legacy of material, much of it from the front line. And that sure looks like my grandfather, those three photos on the top left. They were no photos that we as a family had any awareness. We knew that he had been wounded in the war. We knew he had this big scar on his face. And to confirm it, up there on the top right, far left, Corporal R.B. Fowler, before and after plastic surgery. Well, as you can imagine, this came as rather a shock to us, that these photos existed, that there were some archival documents and even photos of my grandfather at the hospital. And, well, you can see that photo of Granddad there's pretty compelling with his face ripped apart. And here's a quote from the next page of that story. About 12% of all World War One combatants suffered facial wounds. A third of them were left permanently disfigured. 4 photographs of one soldier, 25-year-old machine gunner Corporal R.B. Fowler, opened Callister's chapter on Gillies Pickerel and the other plastic surgeons. Fowler might reasonably be described as having been clipped by artillery fire. Here is what it means to have been clipped. Such an inconsequential sounding word. A gaping path of flesh carved out of the side of his face. His photographs have all the more power because of their unfamiliarity. They do not easily slot into any of the existing mental pictures we have formed of the Great War, writes Callister. Images like these, close-ups of wounded soldiers, are conspicuously absent from our nation's war historiography, and for that matter, the Allied war histories. So, here's this historian writing about my grandfather, and I can understand why, really. These are compelling pictures. To her, though, this was just some World War One soldier she found in the archives. She didn't really realize that there would be a lot of family kicking around in New Zealand closely related to this man, up to and including his second wife and his daughter, and, well, of course, me, the grandson, and other family. Now, of course, what do? Well, we do 2 things. We contact the archivist who had those original photos and all those others, and we run out and we buy Sandy Callister's book, The Face of War, New Zealand's Great War Photography. And one chapter of this book is exclusively devoted to medical photography. And she chose a set of 4 photos of my grandfather to display. And also mentioned in that listener story was that there was an exhibition at a local art gallery. So, of course, my mother and my brothers went there. I couldn't go because I don't live in New Zealand. And I know Sandy Callister was rather shocked to have all these family members come out of the woodwork. And it's an important reminder for historians that there are ethical considerations, that maybe you're studying World War One and you're talking about individual people, but there might very well be children or grandchildren or other people closely related to these people. They're not just names of historical figures. And so this was the exhibition, The Face of War, New Zealand's Great War Photography, which was in the Gus Fisher Gallery in Auckland, New Zealand. And, well, I have a PhD, and as I often tell my students, I think getting a PhD is actually a personality test. It's a test for obsessive disorders, obsessive personality types. who else would spend so many hours and years focusing on one single topic? So naturally, I brought the same level of obsession to researching my grandfather's story. So I then went and tracked down Sandy Callister's earlier work and found this article, Broken Gargoyles, the photographic representations of severely wounded New Zealand soldiers. And which photos did she choose to lead off with? The 4 photos of my grandfather. You notice the listener mentioned 4, but only included 3. So front and side in October of 1918 and front and side in December of 1918, before and after plastic surgery. And again, she particularly talks about him. And by the way, this is advice I always give my students in writing essays. I say never use photos or images just to be pretty. If you're going to put an image in your essay, make sure you talk about it. And Sandy Callister does a good job of doing this. So here we have what she had to say in her earlier article. The medical notes accompanying the photograph tell us that Fowler suffered a gunshot wound on the Western Front on 8th of October 1918. Another detail we never knew, that he had been wounded on the 8th of October. 9 days later, he was admitted to Queen Mary's Hospital in England. On 18th October 1918, the top 2 photographs in the sequence were taken. The bottom 2 photographs were taken on 20 December 1918. We observe that the wound has been closed, and in its place is a disfigured, puckered scar. These are headshots taken frontally and in profile with the purpose of documenting Fowler's injury and repair as accurately as possible. This man I look at once belonged to a regiment, a community, a country. Too damn right he did. My family. His photographs have all the more power because of their unfamiliarity. They do not easily slot into any of the existing mental pictures New Zealanders have formed of the Great War. Images like these, close-ups of the wounded, are conspicuously absent from our nation's war historiography. You can see where some of the lines for the listener story came from. And for that matter, the Allied war histories. Their visual violence has the potential to challenge and subvert the many words written about war, especially this war. Here, a wounded man occupies the foreground. I can neither refuse his gaze nor disavow his gaping wounds. I actually found a picture online of a guy who had just seen this picture and had been inspired to write a pencil drawing of it. And unfortunately, it seems to have disappeared off the internet. I can't find it anymore. And there they are again in close-up, so you can see a better detail. And there's a photo of what he looked like. I think I can date this particular photo to 1917, probably, on the right. So there he is before he got wounded. You can see he was a handsome young man. And you can see, well, he's obviously not very happy. And what a terrible wound he had suffered. Ripped his face apart, broken his jaw, and but also really what a quite remarkable job they did of patching him up. And as I started digging, I found there was a collection of over 80 watercolor paintings. The New Zealand Army had found that the black and white photography they had didn't record all the necessary information because color was an important part of recording the wounds and the treatments. So they actually commissioned an artist to work at the hospital to paint pictures of wounded soldiers, and over 80 of them survived. Now, this is again one of those stories of accidental survival of records. Things survive or things don't just by pure chance. Now, in this case, Pickerel, one of the main doctors who had set up this hospital in England, went back to New Zealand and set up a jaw ward in Dunedin. And somehow or other, all of the records that he took with him ended up in the New Zealand Dental School, which is also in Dunedin. And Professor Sandy McAllister was going through the boxes and files, and I think they were honestly just looking for things to throw away to clear up some space, and found this box of all of these artifacts, including all these watercolors. That's why the collection of watercolor paintings, you can Google it and find it yourself, is called the McAllister Collection. And I was hoping I'd find my grandfather, and sure enough, there he is, Corporal Fowler, New Zealand Machine Gun Corps, 22nd of October, 1918. And I mentioned that we contacted the archivist for Queen Mary's Hospital, and if we had had a grandfather or a relative at almost any other hospital in World War I, we would have been out of luck. But this particular hospital and this particular ward plays an absolutely important role in the history of plastic surgery. Gillies and Pickerel pioneered so many of the techniques that are well, that are used even still down to today. And if you get a textbook about plastic surgery, and the history of how it developed, you'll find chapter one will have a huge chunk about this particular ward at this hospital. As a result of this, the records have survived. And so on the right, you can see the X-ray of his broken jaw, and on the left, they even have the treatment plan and all the different procedures that they went through, and that there was, you can see, multiple X-rays were taken, and the pencil diagram of his broken jaw and all the rest. Absolutely phenomenal that we could have something like this. You can go from not knowing any of this stuff existed to finding, well, look at it all. And Andrew Bamji, the man I was referring to, went on to write a book about that topic, Faces from the Front, Harold Gillies, the Queen's Hospital, Sidcup, and the Origins of Modern Plastic Surgery. Now, he had a lot of photos of the wounded men, but what he didn't have was many examples of what the men looked like before they were wounded, and also didn't have many examples of the long-term prognosis. What did these men look like in the later years? But because we'd been in contact with them, we shared a number of family photos with him. So he was able to use the photo that I opened this PowerPoint slide, the young, handsome man before he was wounded, and that was included in the book. The photos of his before and after surgery were there, and also this photo that you can see here. And unfortunately, through some level of miscommunication, there is a colossal mistake in the caption for this photo. It says it is Robert Bruce Fowler with his daughter. But my grandmother passed away in 1960, and at age 70, Granddad remarried a girl 30 years younger than him, Anwell. And because my grandmother passed away in 1960, I never knew her. Anwell was the only grandmother I ever knew. In fact, as a little kid, I used to think Anwell meant grandmother because we had a granddad and Anwell. My parents would say, we're going to go and visit Granddad and Anwell. Anwell to me was more of a title. So, and I also like to think there's hope for me. Good genes. Granddad still had it when he was 70. And there are quite a number of other ways in which Grandad is featured in media. So there was a television New Zealand special about World War One and plastic surgery and all the rest. And at one stage, there's a panning shot where they kind of laid out a lot of these watercolors that survive as if it was back in the hospital in World War One, kind of bit of docudrama stuff. And as it pans across, well, look down there on the bottom left, you will recognize the painting that I just showed you of my grandfather. They never mention him by name, but of course, I spotted him. There he is. Now, here are a couple of family photos taken at various years later. The one on the left is a bit earlier, the one on the right a bit later. My mother actually hadn't been born at any of these. She was one of these last-minute surprises. The little boy on the photo on the right was my Uncle Dick, and he was about 10 years older than my mother, so it was a good few years before my mother would arrive on the scene. And I'm pretty familiar with these photos, old family photos that you have on the wall. And it took me a long time to realize something pretty interesting. Where's his wound? Where's his scar? It's not there. He was sensitive about it, and my mother recalls, she feels embarrassed now, that she felt a bit ashamed of her father having this big scar on his face. She really regrets it now. And it's only when you really zoom in, you can actually see there on his face that there is a bit of different coloration or texture where it's Photoshop before computers. They've airbrushed out his scar so you can see what he would have looked like if he hadn't been disfigured in the war. But these are what he really looked like. And Granddad died when I was 15, so I have memories of him. I mean, he was crippled by a number of strokes in his later years, so most of my memory of him, he couldn't talk very well and he was confined to a wheelchair, but he still had an active mind and he still made tapestries and baskets and things like this. And honestly, I don't think I ever really realized that he did have a big scar on his face. To me, that's just what Granddad looked like. And, old people's faces tend to have lots of creases in it. He just had a really big one in his left cheek. So there's my mother and two of her siblings with Granddad on the left. There he is as Sunday school superintendent, keeping people quiet outside St. John's Church in Wellington. And there he is with Anwell on the right, probably not long after they were married. And that's all I've got to share with you initially. But as you can imagine, this kicked off an awful lot of questions. Okay, how did he get wounded on October the 8th? What exactly was going on? And in future, I plan to make another video, and I'm giving you a bit of a teaser here. And here are some images that feature heavily in that story. So this painting that you see in the background of like a factory and some barbed wire and so on is in the area of the village of Lesdane. And that is where the New Zealand division was attacking on October the 8th. And it was a crucial attack because we're getting near the end of the war. It's part of the Hundred Days Offensive. The Allies have been slamming into the famous Hindenburg Line, that impregnable defense line, and finally, on October the 8th, they got the breakthrough. It was the last bastion. They broke through. There was open country with no trenches or defense lines for miles in front of them. The dream that the Allies had had for all of World War One was accomplished on October the 8th by the New Zealanders. And it was during this battle that my grandfather was shot through the face. And there is a story involving a tank battle in which two German tanks, which were captured British tanks that had been repurposed and returned against the Allies, were thrown into the desperate German defense, and a British tank came up and blew the crap out of them. And that is part of this one of the little episodes that happened during the New Zealand assault on October the 8th. And this one down on the bottom right was from a training exercise when they were training, heavy machine gunners and what it was like. But it was taken not in late 1918, and I can't help imagining that it was something like that where my grandfather was wounded because, I mean, obviously he didn't really know, and the family stories are a bit vague, like exactly what hit him. But what we believe is that he was manning one of these heavy machine guns, and a piece of shrapnel ricocheted, hit the machine gun, and ricocheted off the machine gun, and ripped through his face. So that picture on the bottom right, and then the photo in the middle. That one is a family friend who attended, well, that was his 21st birthday party, and he had a man who attended his birthday party, and I was lucky enough to get this photo because a granddad tells the story about how Jimmy Smallbone, James Thomas Smallbone, was the man who saved his life and dragged him back to the aid station when he was shot through the face on October the 18th. So just to whet your appetite, come back for future stories, and you'll hear the story of Jimmy Smallbone and, well, many, many other interesting and sometimes quite funny stories that I've encountered as I've been doing this research into my grandfather.